Hi everyone, you're here sewing with Cody, and this video is the first block video that we'll be doing. As you can see, we've got a number of blocks that we'll be covering. Each block will have its own video, of course, like I explained in the introductory video. But in today's video, we'll be working on this block, which I named Miss Barbara's block. So with all of our quilt blocks, they're all consisted of multiple squares, but just for the most part, at least for the first ones we'll be doing, each square is identical. So let's take a closer look and dive into what we need to do to create this quite simple block using the Creative Grid Lazy Angle Ruler. So let's go take a look. Okay, so we're ready to start cutting our pieces. So the first piece we're going to cut is from our white, which is our background fabric. So what we're going to do is we're going to square up this edge to make sure we have a nice straight edge from where we're starting to cut. So I like to line up my folded edge on the side with one of these lines here. And so we have a nice straight edge. So then we'll cut this so we have this nice straight edge to work with. So now I've got a nice straight edge. So now we're going to cut 5.5 inch pieces. So all the pieces that we're cutting for this block and all of the blocks that have they're made up of just 4 smaller blocks, everything's going to be cut 5.5 inch strips or pieces. So with this ruler, we'll line it up with the 5.5 marking here. So again, we're making sure that this is on a straight line, that this folds on a straight line, and that our 5.5 inch marking is lined up with that edge we just cut. So we'll go and cut that, and so that's all we're going to need for this block from the white, and we're going to go and do the same thing for the other 2 colors. So here we've got all 3 of our colors cut, and we did use the 6.5 by 24.5 inch ruler to cut those strips. This is, if you only have one ruler, this is a ruler you need, obviously, because this is a ruler that you use to cut any of the fabric that you've got cut off the bolt from the shop or whatever, because it's longer than the length is of half of the width of the fabric as it comes off the bolt. So that is the most used ruler for sure. So now I've got all 3 pieces. So now we're going to work with them individually, and we're going to cut our different pieces. So let's get started. So we're going to start with the first one, which is our background fabric. So this one is going to be the largest trapezoid we're going to cut. But first, what we're going to do is we need to start with a nice square edge. So right here, we're dealing with the bias on the left side. And do remember they is folded in half. So we're able to cut 2 pieces at a time. So a 6.5 by 6.5 inch ruler is an excellent size ruler for a lot of things, for squaring up smaller blocks, for trimming off edges and everything. So this is one of my favorite rulers. This is a ruler we'll be using throughout the entire quilt project. So what I do is I line up beyond the salvage on both ends. I line up the bottom edge of this strip fabric with one of the horizontal lines here. So that ensures that I know that I'm cutting a straight line. And you can double check it by the top of the ruler or one of the lines at the top of the ruler as well. So what we're going to do, we're going to cut this edge off. So now I've got a nice straight edge on this end. So then we get to finally start using our lazy angle ruler. So we'll be using this ruler throughout the entire project, obviously, because That's what the whole project is about, is using the lazy angle ruler. And we'll be using all different sides of the ruler. But one thing to remember, there's only two sides we're going to be cutting on. Is this angled side here and this flat side on this on the left side. We're not going to be cutting from the bottom or the top. So we may have to rotate the ruler forwards and backwards, but we're not going to be cutting but from the two sides. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to cut our largest trapezoid piece. And remember, everything is using 5.5-inch measurements for this block and 3 of the other blocks. So when we're looking at our ruler, we can see all of these different markings. And we're not going to go over any of them until we're going to use them. So right now, what we're going to do is we're going to be using this large trapezoid piece here. And so we can see that there's 5.5-inch markings. And that's what we're going to line up this background piece for this particular block with. So what we're going to do is we're going to line up this nice 90-degree corner edge that we just recently cut and squared off with this 5.5-inch marking. And so you can see the size of the trapezoid that's going to be made. And this is the large one. So there's 2 different size trapezoids that we'll be making. This is being the large one, and give you an idea, this is the small one. So you can get a good idea of the different sizes. So in my written instructions on my blog, I talk about a large trapezoid and a small trapezoid. This is the small one. So with all the blocks, for the most part, if I remember correctly, we're only cutting for each small square, we're only cutting 1 trapezoid. 1 large trapezoid. Some of them may require only 1 small, but some of them may require 2 or 3. This particular one calls for 2 smalls and 1 large. So let's go and cut this one. And remember, when we're cutting 2 layers at a time. So here is 1, 2. And so for every finished square, we're going to need 4 of these. Well, for every finished square of this particular block, we're going to need 4 of them. So now that we've got these 2 cut, remember we started with a flat edge. So now we're starting with an angled edge. So here we're going to place the ruler a little differently. And I'm going to show you what we're going to do. So what we're going to do is, so this is how it finished. So now we're going to take the ruler. So this is how we're cutting it before. Now we're going to rotate the ruler. And now we're going to be using this 5.5-inch marking. So before we were using this 5.5-inch marking. Now we're just going to rotate it. And now we're going to be using this one. So if you look, we get the same exact shape. And all we had to do, we didn't have to rotate our fabric. We just need to rotate our ruler. And so we just line it up nicely with the 5.5. Solid line here. And then we're just going to cut. So now we are done with this piece of fabric because we've got our 4 background pieces. So here are our 4 background pieces. So now we are going to cut our smaller trapezoids. So we can set these to the side, and let's pull our next color, which is this one, which is fabric A. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to trim off this edge here. So we have a nice straight edge. So now we are going to cut smaller trapezoids of these, and we're going to be using a different part of the ruler to do this. So before we used this one to create a nice big trapezoid, now we're going to be using this one. So I'll lay it down so you can see a little better. So as you can see here, we're creating a smaller trapezoid. And so we'll come down looking here, and we're on this 5.5-inch marking. So what we're going to do is we're going to trim this. So here we're getting 2 trapezoids, 2 small ones. And now, so this is where it's actually easier to rotate the fabric. And all you have to do is just flip the fabric. And so we were cutting using this side. Now we're going to rotate it like we did with the background. And now we're going to cut using this side. So as we can see here, we see this angle coming down. And look, there's a 5.5 right there. And so that's going to line up nicely with this cut side. So see, we've got this angle here, and we've got this flat bottom. So now all we need to do is cut this. So then we've got 4 fabric A trapezoids. And some of you may have noticed how we're flipping fabric, we're cutting different angles and different sides. That's why we're using solid fabric, like I mentioned in the introductory video. Why it's so important, especially when we're just starting off and we're doing this, especially if this is new to a lot of y'all. It's so much easier to work with solid fabric because you don't have to worry which direction the fabric is going or how we're rotating the fabric or the ruler, because no matter which way you flip these or which way you have to flip them, it's the same color. There's no pattern, there's nothing. So that's why it's so important to, at least for the first round, stick with solid fabric. It will make your life so much easier, and it'll go quite a bit quicker, because otherwise you'll be cutting or need to cut one layer at a time typically, to make sure the fabric's always facing up or the right direction. When you rotate it, you may have to cut off and start off always with a flat edge or a 90-degree corner, because the pattern of the fabric will have to only go that one way, and you have to make sure when you're cutting that you're cutting the right direction. Here, when it's solids like this, it doesn't matter. Or if you're dealing with a batik where there's no true, really noticeable front or back to the fabric. So we're going to do the same thing that we did to our fabric A to our fabric B. Okay, so now we've got 4 background, 4 fabric A, and 4 fabric B. That's all we need because one square will use one of each. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take our background fabric, and we're going to take, it doesn't really matter which one, but we're going to take one of fabric A. The one thing I do say is sometimes it doesn't matter which one you start off with, sometimes, but make sure you're consistent with all 4 blocks. So here we're just going to start off with fabric A, and you can see this is how it's going to look once it's sewn together. So give you an idea of how to place the fabric. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our fabric A, lay the cut angled ends together, and what you are going to notice is you're going to have a little overlap here and a little overlap on both of these here. Because the way the ruler cut them, it kind of lopped off that end, which is perfectly fine, because when you come with your 1/4-inch seam, your stitching should meet at the valley of those 2 little peaks. So we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew these together, and we can get a look and see how they look when they're all pieced. So one thing you can do before we go sew them all together is we can place them all how they're going to need to be, and we can pin them together just so they're together. And then we get to the sewing machine, you can kind of really fix that to where it needs to be to make sure everything's lining up and that our raw edges are nice together, nice and neat together. All right, so we got all 4 squares. Now let's move over to the sewing machine. Here we are at the sewing machine. And so I have my sewing machine all set up to piece our quilt blocks together. So I've got my single needle stitch plate, which is my 0mm stitch plate. Got my 1/4-inch foot, in this case it's a 97D. I've got my built-in dual feed since I'm working on a Bernina. And so in the bobbin, I have Deco Bob 80 weight thread, and on the top I am using Orifil 50 weight. And I have it on a big cone, so I just feed it through a thread stand. And of course, I've always got my handy dandy little by Annie awl, so if I ever need help some thread along, I'm all ready to go. So we're going to start with our first piece. And so I want to make sure that all my little notches on the edge are all nice and neat and all lined up along the edge. So as you know with a 1/4 inch foot, or if you don't, the 1/4 inch foot on the right hand side and sometimes on the left hand side as well, it's a 1/4 inch from the center needle position. So we want to make sure we line up our raw edge with the side edge of the foot. So we can drop our foot, line it up, and we can start sewing. So one thing to make sure we're getting that perfect 1/4 inch in that perfect location is so where that white fabric and where in this case the pink fabric join, kind of like right at that bottom, that little valley, we want to make sure that's where we start stitching. So that means we have our fabric placed exactly where it needs to be placed, and we should end in a similar location. So let's make sure we stay lined up. And also with a lot of the stitch plates, we have a little marking here. And so that little marking there, right, basically the first marking on the Bernina, that's your 1/4 inch marking. So you can use the foot and the marking on the stitch plates to really help you out. So we should end right at that little valley. Perfect. So we can go and chain piece these all together. So that means we're just going to not cut our thread and just continue feeding more blocks in. So we'll go and do this for all 4 blocks. So now we have all 4 little blocks sewn. So you can see they're still chain pieced together. So I can remove all my little pins. And I can go and I can snip all of these. So now they're all separate. So now we're going to move over to the iron and we are going to press these seams flat. So I mentioned in the instructions for each block about pressing to the dark side. And I'll show you that at the iron too, but while we're right here, I can always explain it multiple times. So what we're going to do, so our pink fabric is darker than our white fabric. So what we're going to do when we press it, we're actually going to press it so this seam or this fold is underneath our dark fabric. So it's less likely to be seen when we look on the top of our little quilt block. So we're going to press that like this, and of course press with the iron. So when we look at it, you don't see that fold. However, if we fold it the other way, the odds that you would see it underneath the white are much higher. So if we look, and with the light coming from the machine, it's really hard to see. But we'll see it when we hit it to the iron. But once you put in your quilt block, you'll see that 1/4 inch fold underneath your white fabric here is visible. You should be able to see it here. If it was under the pink, it wouldn't be that noticeable. So let's go through the iron and press these out. So here we are with our pieces. So what we're going to do again, we're going to press this to the dark side and just fold it under like this. And something I really, really, really want everyone to pay attention to is when you do press this, make sure you're actually pressing your seam back. Because I quilt hundreds of quilts for customers a year, and so many quilts that come in, they're pressed, but they're not pressed flat. They're not pressed fully out. So what happens is the seam is pressed, but there's actually a little flap or a little gap. So there's actually more fabric here, and it's not pressed flat. And it's so important because it can make your quilt really wonky, especially if you press it and then you have to go and trim something. You're now trimming it to say a 5-inch square, but you have a little extra here. So when you actually go and piece it together, you miraculously come out with more fabric. And it's no longer 5 inches, it may be 5 1/8 or 5 1/4 in some cases. And I see this far too often. And we see it a lot when it's on angles. So make sure when you're pressing this that you press it so this is completely flattened out. It's very important because I see it so often. And with this one, I'm going to show you why we press to the dark side. So if we press this to the light side, and I'll actually press with the iron. So can you see that 1/4-inch seam? You really can't see it when it's pressed to the dark side. You see it a little bit, and it's maybe more noticeable on camera, but in person it's not nearly as noticeable as it is here. And this really helps. It just, because what it does, it adds another element to the quilt that you really don't want there. So you rather not see or see very little than to see something like this, especially the more you piece together, especially when you're working on such a light fabric like white. That's noticeable and it can be distracting. So we're going to go back and press this one towards the dark side. Now there are some cases, and sometimes we may encounter some, where we have no choice but to press it to the lighter side, and that's perfectly fine. But if we encounter those, I'll mention those again. So here are our 4 blocks, and they're identical. So now, let's see over there. So now we're going to cut something off of these 4 blocks, and then we'll sew another small trapezoid to each one, and then we'll be done with each block. This is a fairly simple block. All right, so let's go back to cutting. All right, we're back to the cutting table. So now we're going to take 1 block at a time, and we want to face them so our fabric A, or in this case the pink fabric, is oriented to the left, and the bottom, the wide bottom is to the bottom, and facing up. So we're going to take our ruler, and remember everything's 5 1/2 inches. So we're going to trim this like we were cutting a large trapezoid from our original background fabric. So what we're going to do is we're going to line it up so the angle is on this side, and we're going to line the left side and the bottom side along the 5 1/2 inch marking, and we're going to trim off this excess. One thing I want you to take note, not panic about, is if you notice on this bottom corner here, the fabric doesn't reach all the way to the edge, which that's perfectly normal. You'll have that encounter almost every time. But we want to make sure that the sides and the bottom, which is what the lines you've got on your ruler, that they're lined up with the edge of your fabric. So we're going to do, we're just going to cut off that little piece. And we're going to do this to the rest of the squares. So let's go do that. Okay, so we've got all 4 of our pieces cut. So now we are going to sew the fabric B on. So we can lay them out, so this is how they're going to be sewn on. So this is kind of like this is what your block, one of your smaller blocks is going to look like once it's all sewn. So what we're going to do is we're going to lay all these out just like we did when we when we sewed fabric A on. We can go and pin them just so they're where they need to be. So we get to the sewing machine, it just makes it easier. It goes a little bit quicker. This is something else that everybody needs, is a magnetic pin cushion. This one even has a little lid so your pins don't fall out when you're traveling. It's really nice. And it sits like this. This is just wonderful. I can't ask for a better pin cushion. Especially when you've dropped them on the ground, you can easily go and pick them all up and they orient exactly where they need to be. Best investment. That and a few other things. So we've got them all pinned. So now let's go back to the sewing machine and sew them together. So here we're back at the sewing machine and we've got our fabric B on. So now let's just sew this together just like we did with fabric A. So now I've got them all sewn together. Again, we'll remove the pins and separate our little chain pieced little blocks. And then we'll move over to the iron. And again, we'll be pressing to the dark side, just like that. So let's go to the iron and let's go press. So we're back at the iron. So now we're going to press these. And again, we're going to get them nice and flat or completely pressed out. Hit them with the iron. And we'll do this to all 4 smaller little blocks. And I like to kind of finger press them first just to make sure I get that seam completely pressed out. And then hit with the iron. And of course, I love using some steam. And one thing when we're pressing blocks or anything, you don't want to press real hard down and you don't want to push out because you can start stretching and distorting your fabric. You really just want to press down and just let the weight of the iron hold it. And that's why I like steam, because it really flattens everything out, but I'm not pushing down. It's only the weight of the iron that's being applied to my fabric. All right, so these blocks are pretty much done. We're gonna go to the cutting board and I'm gonna show you some of the things, or cutting table. I'm gonna show you some of the things that we're gonna do to prepare this before we sew them together, but we're almost there. So let's go back to the cutting table. So here we're back at the cutting table with our little blocks. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna wanna make sure that these blocks measure as close as possible to 5.5 inches. Because so the initial strip that we cut, or strips that we cut at that 5.5 inch mark, that is also what our finished size should be. So our finished block is going to be 10.5 inches. So these blocks should be 5.5 inches. So another reason why I like this 6.5 inch ruler. So what we're going to do is we can line it up with different parts of the ruler depending on what you want to work with. So with the Creative Grid rulers, what I love so much, which can be confusing at first, is half the ruler is in 1.5 inch increments because they added an extra half, and the other one is just in non-fractions, just whole numbers. So you can use whatever side you want, but since I am looking for a 5.5 inch square, I'm going to use the fraction side. So what I'm doing is I am lining up my 5.5 inch mark here and my 5.5 inch mark here and just making sure that it's a 5.5 inch square, and it is. So what I'm going to do now, and you can do that and check all of them, but what I like to do is all these little dog ears, is what people call them, these little notches on the side. I like to trim all that up at this stage as well, because what that's going to do, it's going to make it easier to sew everything together where you don't have these little pieces sticking out. So you could use the ruler as a guide, or you can just go and trim off these little dog ears so the sides of your block are nice and clean and crisp. Again, you can go and check each size of your block, but I'd like to also, once you're done with that, is to trim up these little dog ears. And also, this can make the back of your quilt look much nicer and flatter in some cases, especially if you're dealing with a lot of pieces. All right, so we're pretty much there. So what we're going to do, we're going to orient the block, and I'll show you 2 different ways. You can choose whichever way you want because this is your quilt. So here is one of the block orientations. So with this orientation, you have your little pinwheel, your stars, we're going to call it, using 2 different colors. But if you want, you can orient it so you're using the same color, either fabric B, or you can change it around and use fabric A. It is up to you. You are in control of this. But so it's completely up to you what you want to do. But for sake of matching the quilt, I'm gonna do it like this. So what we're gonna do is, like I mentioned in the instructions for the block, is I like to work with the top and the bottom separately, which I think is really the only way you can do it. But this is how I'm gonna do it at least. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take these two, line them up so our edges are nice and lined up. And so let's kind of just move it around. And of course, we're going to take our little pins, or you can use binding clips. Binding clips are awesome. I'll use those in some of the other videos too. And give it a little pin. So that's together. And then come down here and do the same thing. And the reason I like to pin and do all this before I move to the sewing machine is because I want to make sure I know the correct side I need to sew. Because there's a right side and there's a wrong side to sew. So if I pin along the side that I need to sew, and I like to make sure I pin far enough away from the edge so I don't have to worry about removing my pins while I sew. Because some people will pin going this direction. Well, the problem with that is you have to remove that pin before you can proceed. So I like to make sure when I pin that I pin far enough away that the foot, that it's not going to interfere with the foot. See? All right, so let's go to the sewing machine, sew these up, and then we'll come back here. Okay, I'm back from the sewing machine, so we can see here that I've got my 1/4 inch seam on the top and the bottom piece. So now I can remove my pins. And now I've got each top and bottom piece sewn. So you can see that. Now here's something that we want to do. We want to press the seams differently for each piece. So this is how it's going to lay out. So what we're going to do is we're going to press the seams of the bottom one this direction. So we're going to press it so it's going in that orientation. It's going towards the left. And so reason I chose this one to go towards the left is because that seam's being pressed underneath this dark fabric, opposed to being pressed over here to the white fabric or the background fabric. And now this one, I'm gonna press the seam going that way. Again, so you don't see it under the white. So we kind of just finger press that and run over to the iron and press that down. And you're gonna ask why those particular ways, or why we're doing it two opposite directions. It's not solely because of the background fabric. Actually, that's secondary. The main reason why is so we fold this down or lay this down on top of each other. When we press, we want these seams to go in opposite directions. So because we have bulky fabric going this way and bulky fabric going the opposite direction on the other piece, when we push these together, they're going to want to lock in. So they're going to lay nice and flat. So when we sew them, that seam, they're going to line up beautifully. That's the trick to getting these seams to match up nicely. It's kind of notching them in there by having a seam going one direction and the back side going the opposite direction. And this is where some cases where you have to press fabric going towards the light side opposed to the dark side, just because I feel this is more important than seeing a little bit of that seam underneath the lighter fabric. So let me go press these and I'll be right back. Okay, so here I've got my seams pressed, nice and flat and nice and pretty. So we are going to make sure that this is how it's supposed to be, which it is. So we'll just lay this one over. We're going to notch that in just like that. And it lays nice and flat. So go under the machine a lot nicer. And we can give that a little pin. So it stays where we need it to stay. You can even put a little bit of glue, like a little applique glue, a little applique glue. And so we just want to make sure that we're lining up the sides together and give that a pin. And we come down here and do that here. And I do like to put pins, which just makes it easier so I can do all this here, especially when you've got dozens and dozens of blocks, you're doing all this at the same time. Because typically if you were making a quilt and they were solely out of these blocks, you're not making one block at a time. You're going to have all these small squares, a stack of them, all at the same exact stage. So when you get to this stage, you're now assembling all these blocks all at the same time. But with our sampler quilt they were doing here, we're only making one block, but you can make as many blocks as you want. But this is why I do pin. So I can do all this and just go to the machine and I know exactly what side I need to sew, and it's all pretty much together, so we don't have to worry about realigning anything. All right, let's go to the machine. So here we're at the machine. So we're going to start sewing. So because we're coming upon multiple bulky seams right here from different pieces, especially at the corner, you may encounter an instance where you need to use your by any stiletto. So, but if it doesn't want to feed too well, we can always stick this little guy right here and kind of help that piece along. So here we are. Let's go to the iron. We'll press this flat and we will be done with our first block. How exciting. All right, let's go to the iron. Okay, so here we have our finished block. Now we just need to press the seams. So now with a quilt block like this, I'm finding, especially with the ones we're working with for this project, I'm finding that it's not best to press these seams one way or the other, because unlike working with a quilt where you're adding, say, like a border or a sashing, we have just a plain piece of fabric at the top, and these seams would naturally want to lay one direction. But with these quilt blocks, we've got seams come from the top and the bottom. So a lot of times what I would like to do in a situation like this is I like to press these seams open instead of pressing them down or up. And that's what we're going to do here. So essentially just going to part these seams open, take our iron, and the point of the iron just really just separates those seams. And using a little bit of steam really helps to force those seams to lay flat. And what that's going to do, it's going to force the quilt to be a lot flatter as well. So you don't have all those like a super bulky seam either at the bottom, especially in the center, at the top. So anytime you're working with a quilt that's got multiple seams coming to that center, open up those seams and they will lay a lot flatter, because right here there's no bulky center. It's nice and flat and not nearly as bulky as it could be. So especially when you come to quilt it, depending on how you're quilting it, that could be a problem. Well, that is it. That is our first block. So that is block number 1, this Barbara's block. And that's all we have to do. So we want to make sure you square this up and make sure that it is 10.5 inches. It should be very, very close if it's not, and that really should be fine. Unless it's too big, then of course you want to make sure it's 10.5 inches. Trim it down a little bit. But all your seams should, at the edge, should look like this, if you're not familiar, because what that is, that allows for a 1/4 inch seam allowance when we go and put our sashing, or if you go and piece these together with another block, because those are going to be lost inner seam allowance to make our points nice and visible once it's all said and done. So this is our first block. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're anxious about the next dozen blocks or so. I'm not even sure how many blocks are in this thing. But so I hope you're excited. And remember, go on to my blog, which is in the description below, to be able to look at and download the paper copy or the written down copy. And I've got pictures for every step and every orientation of what the quilt block should look like. So go to the blog and look at that. Or you can watch the video over and over and over, however many times you need, and that's why I'm creating videos like this instead of doing like a live feed. It's so much easier to do it this way for me as well. And remember, if you enjoy this block, make sure you subscribe to the channel. But if you're doing this and following along, I'm sure you're already subscribed. But make sure you subscribe, give this video a thumbs up. This was a lot of work. and comment in the comment section below, especially if you have a question, because I can easily, like I mentioned in the introductory video, I can easily answer those comments, and other people who may also have that same question can see that comment. But it just helps everybody who's participating in this sew along if you do comment in the section below. Even if it's just, I love this block, or I hate this block, I never want to make one again, or whatever. Let other people see how you're feeling when you're creating this block. All right, well, stay tuned for block number 2. And as always, happy sewing.